My in-laws invited my wife's ex to our baby shower and called him the father this child deserves. I was holding a plate of finger sandwiches when my father-in-law put his arm around my wife's ex-boyfriend and said those words loud enough for half the room to hear. Kimberly was across the patio opening gifts with her mother and sister, 8 months pregnant and glowing in her yellow dress. Austin stood there next to my father-in-law looking uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to correct him. The sandwich plate slipped from my hands and hit the deck with a crash that made everyone turn and stare. My mother-in-law looked at me with this expression that wasn't embarrassment or apology, just mild annoyance that I'd disrupted her carefully planned event. Kimberly's face went pale as she processed what her father had just said, and I watched her mouth open and close without sound coming out. My hands were shaking as I bent down to pick up the broken plate, and I could feel 30 pairs of eyes watching me gather pieces of ceramic while my father-in-law continued his conversation with Austin like nothing had happened. Kimberly and I had been married for 3 years when this happened. We met at a tech conference in Austin where I was presenting research on cloud infrastructure, and she was covering the event for a software magazine. She approached me after my panel with smart questions about data security, and we ended up talking through dinner and into the night at the hotel bar. She was brilliant and funny, with this way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. We started long distance between Seattle and San Francisco, and 6 months later she moved north to be with me. Her parents seemed happy about the engagement, or at least her mother did. Her father, Robert, had been quiet during our announcement dinner, nursing his whiskey and asking pointed questions about my job stability and family background. I'd attributed it to normal protective father behavior and tried to win him over with respect and attention. The wedding planning revealed the first cracks in my relationship with Kimberly's parents. Her mother, Diane, wanted to invite Austin to the ceremony because he'd been such an important part of Kimberly's life for 5 years. Kimberly had shut that down immediately, saying it would be inappropriate and hurtful to me. But Diane had pushed, arguing that Austin was practically family and it would be awkward to exclude him from such a major event. Robert had agreed with his wife, saying Austin had always been respectful and mature, unlike some of Kimberly's other boyfriends. The implication that I was somehow less respectful or mature than her ex hung in the air uncomfortably. Kimberly had stood firm, and Austin didn't attend the wedding. But I noticed that Diane had printed extra photos of Kimberly and Austin from their relationship years and displayed them prominently at the rehearsal dinner alongside childhood pictures. After the wedding, things seemed to settle into an uneasy truce. We visited Kimberly's parents in Sacramento every few months, and Robert would ask me about work in this tone that suggested he was waiting for me to fail. Diane would show Kimberly old photo albums that somehow always included multiple pictures of Austin, talking about what a handsome couple they'd made and how invested she'd been in their relationship. Kimberly would change the subject, and I'd pretend not to notice the pointed nostalgia. Then we'd drive back to Seattle, and Kimberly would apologize for her parents' behavior, saying they were just having trouble accepting that she'd moved on. I believed her because I wanted to, because acknowledging the truth would have meant confronting something I wasn't ready to face. The situation escalated when Kimberly got pregnant. We'd been trying for about 6 months, and seeing the positive test together felt like the start of something beautiful. We waited until the second trimester to tell our families, wanting to make sure everything was stable first. My parents were overjoyed, already planning visits and buying baby clothes. Kimberly's parents had a different reaction. Diane's first question after congratulations was whether Austin knew. Kimberly looked confused and said no. Why would he know? We weren't in contact with him. Diane had made this disappointed sound and said she'd always imagined Austin would be the father of her grandchildren. Robert had added that Austin had always wanted kids and would have been a devoted father. I sat there at their dining table trying to process the fact that my in-laws were openly wishing another man had fathered my child. Kimberly had gotten angry then, telling her parents their comments were hurtful and inappropriate. She'd said I was her husband and the father of her baby, and they needed to accept that reality. Diane had teared up and said she was just being honest about her feelings, that she couldn't help being attached to Austin after investing so much in their relationship. Robert had defended his wife, saying they'd known Austin for 5 years and had grown to love him like a son. When Kimberly pointed out that Austin had broken up with her, that he'd ended their relationship to move to Boston for work, Diane had said that proved he was ambitious and goal-oriented. The evening had ended with Kimberly crying in our hotel room and me feeling completely powerless to protect her from her own parents. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I started noticing Robert and Diane's social media activity after that visit. They'd always posted about family events and holidays, but now there was a new pattern. Diane would post throwback photos of Kimberly and Austin with captions about young love and missed opportunities. Robert shared articles about men who'd reconnected with their first loves years later and lived happily ever after. When Kimberly announced our pregnancy on Facebook, Diane had commented with congratulations, followed by a tagged photo of Austin from some recent event, saying she was sure he'd have his own family news soon. The public nature of their preference was humiliating, and Kimberly's friends started asking her privately what was going on with her parents. She'd make excuses about them being eccentric and stuck in the past, but I could see the hurt in her eyes every time she defended them. The baby shower planning started 4 months before the due date. Kimberly's sister Melissa wanted to host it in Sacramento, so extended family could attend easily. I'd been hesitant about having it in her parents' territory, but Kimberly had assured me it would be fine. Melissa was reasonable and would keep things appropriate. The guest list went back and forth for weeks, and I noticed Diane kept suggesting people I didn't recognize. When I asked Kimberly who they were, she'd check and report back that they were her mother's friends who'd known her during the Austin years. I'd push back, saying the shower should be about celebrating our baby, not recreating Diane's social circle from 5 years ago. Kimberly agreed and had several tense phone conversations with her mother about boundaries. Then, 3 weeks before the shower, Melissa called Kimberly crying. She said their mother had gone behind her back and sent additional invitations to people not on the approved list. When Melissa confronted her, Diane had said she was paying for half the shower and deserved input on guests. The argument had escalated until Robert got involved, saying Melissa was being controlling and their mother's friends should be welcome. Melissa had threatened to cancel the whole event, and Diane had responded by saying she'd host it herself if necessary. Kimberly spent 2 hours on the phone mediating between her mother and sister, and by the end, everyone was upset, and nothing was resolved. I suggested we just cancel and have a small gathering in Seattle with our actual friends, but Kimberly wanted her family there despite everything. She said her parents would eventually come around once the baby was born. The morning of the shower, Kimberly and I drove down to Sacramento and checked into a hotel near her parents' house. The event was at a country club where Diane had memberships, and Melissa had decorated the space with gender-neutral colors since we were waiting to find out the sex at birth. We arrived early to help set up, and I was carrying boxes of supplies from the car when I saw Austin's sedan in the parking lot. I recognized it immediately because he'd had the same silver Lexus when he and Kimberly were dating, and she'd pointed it out once when we'd spotted it at a restaurant. My stomach dropped as I stood there holding a box of paper plates, trying to convince myself there was some other explanation. Maybe it was a different silver Lexus. Maybe Austin was at the country club for a different event. I found Kimberly inside talking to Melissa about table arrangements and pulled her aside. I told her Austin's car was in the parking lot, and she looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. She said that was impossible. There was no way her mother would have invited him without telling us. But her voice had uncertainty in it, and I saw the moment she realized it was exactly something her mother would do. We found Diane in the kitchen directing the catering staff, and Kimberly asked directly if Austin was coming. Diane had smiled and said yes. She'd invited him because he'd been asking about Kimberly and the baby. She'd said it in this casual tone like she was discussing what sandwiches to serve. Kimberly's face went white, and she told her mother to uninvite him immediately. Diane had refused, saying Austin was already on his way, and it would be rude to turn him away at the door. The argument that followed made the catering staff leave the kitchen. Kimberly demanded to know why her mother had invited her ex-boyfriend to her baby shower without permission. Diane said she didn't need permission to invite guests to an event she was co-hosting. Robert appeared and backed his wife up, saying Austin had every right to be there as someone who cared about Kimberly's well-being. I'd finally spoken up, saying this was insane and disrespectful to both Kimberly and me. Robert had turned on me then, asking what I was so threatened by. He'd said if I was secure in my marriage, Austin's presence shouldn't bother me. The circular logic was maddening, and I felt my face getting hot with anger and humiliation. Melissa was crying and apologizing, saying she had no idea her mother had done this. Kimberly looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked what we should do. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to take my wife and drive back to Seattle immediately, but guests were already arriving, and Kimberly's grandmother was walking in with gifts. Kimberly's cousins pulled up with their kids, and Melissa's friends appeared carrying food. Leaving would have caused a scene and disappointed a lot of people who'd traveled to celebrate with us. Kimberly squeezed my hand and said we should stay, that we could ignore Austin and get through this one afternoon. I agreed because I loved her and because I didn't want to let Diane win by disrupting the event. But I felt sick as we walked back out to the patio and started greeting guests who had no idea what was happening. Austin arrived 30 minutes later, carrying an expensive-looking gift bag. He was taller than I remembered from the wedding photos I'd seen, with the kind of put-together appearance that suggested money and status. He worked in private equity, according to Kimberly, making significantly more than my cybersecurity engineer salary. Diane rushed to greet him like he was the guest of honor, hugging him and leading him around to introduce him to people. I watched her present him to relatives as Kimberly's dear friend from college, strategically omitting that he was the ex-boyfriend. Robert joined them and started showing Austin around the country club, pointing out features and talking about golf like they were old buddies. Kimberly stood next to me with her hand protectively on her pregnant belly, and I could feel her shaking slightly. The first hour was awkward, but manageable. Austin kept his distance mostly, talking to Diane and Robert and some of their friends. Kimberly opened gifts and smiled for photos, and I stood behind her chair playing the supportive husband role. But I noticed Robert and Diane steering every conversation back to Austin somehow. When someone asked about our baby registry, Diane mentioned that Austin had picked out the most thoughtful gift. When a cousin commented on Kimberly's pregnancy glow, Robert said she'd always been beautiful, but especially when she was happy. and he remembered when Austin made her this happy years ago. The comments were constant small cuts, each one subtle enough to ignore individually but collectively, creating a narrative where Austin belonged at this event more than I did. Then came the moment with the sandwiches and Robert's comment that started this whole nightmare spiraling into crisis. After the plate crashed and I cleaned up the broken pieces, Kimberly excused herself to the bathroom. I followed her and found her standing outside the country club crying so hard she could barely breathe. She kept apologizing and saying she couldn't believe her father had said that in front of everyone. I held her and told her it wasn't her fault, that her parents were the ones behaving inappropriately. But inside, I was thinking about how we still had 2 hours left at this event, and a lifetime of dealing with in-laws who actively wished I wasn't the father of their grandchild. Melissa appeared and said she was so sorry, that she was taking over the rest of the shower, and Diane and Robert needed to leave. We went back inside to find absolute chaos. Robert and Diane were arguing with Melissa, while guests stood around looking uncomfortable. Austin had apparently tried to leave after the sandwich incident, but Diane had blocked his way and insisted he stay. Robert was telling Melissa she was being dramatic and that everyone was overreacting. Several of Kimberly's aunts had overheard the original comment and were demanding to know what Robert meant. Kimberly's grandmother asked loudly if someone wanted to explain why there was a strange man at her granddaughter's baby shower and why Robert was calling him the real father. The situation had detonated in the 15 minutes we'd been gone, and now there was no containing it. I made the decision to leave then. I told Kimberly we were going, and she nodded immediately. Melissa helped us gather our gifts while apologizing repeatedly. We walked out to our car with Diane calling after us, saying we were being childish and ruining a beautiful celebration. Robert shouted that I needed to learn to handle adult situations with maturity. I loaded the trunk while Kimberly got in the passenger seat, and I could see her shoulders shaking with sobs. The drive back to Seattle took 6 hours, and we barely spoke except for me asking if she was okay and her saying no. We stopped twice so she could throw up from stress, and I felt helpless watching my pregnant wife fall apart because her parents had deliberately humiliated both of us. The fallout started within hours. Melissa called to say the shower had ended early with guests leaving confused and upset. She said several family members were demanding answers about who Austin was and why Robert and Diane had invited him. Kimberly's grandmother had called Robert directly and told him his behavior was disgraceful. Kimberly's aunts were sending group texts asking what was going on. The family group chat exploded with people taking sides, some defending Robert and Diane's right to invite whoever they wanted, others saying they'd crossed a serious line. Kimberly's phone buzzed constantly with messages, and eventually she turned it off because reading them made her cry harder. My phone rang around midnight with an unknown Sacramento number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Austin. His voice was careful and apologetic when he said we needed to talk about what happened. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing at our baby shower, and he said Diane had called him 3 weeks ago begging him to come. She'd told him that Kimberly was making a mistake with her marriage and needed to see Austin to remember what real love felt like. She'd said the pregnancy was moving too fast, and Kimberly seemed unhappy in photos. Austin claimed he'd tried to refuse multiple times, but Diane had been persistent and emotional, and eventually he'd agreed to make an appearance to get her to stop calling. I asked Austin why he was telling me this now, and he said because what happened today was wrong, and he felt guilty. He said he'd broken up with Kimberly 5 years ago because they wanted different things, and he'd moved on with his life. He had a girlfriend in Boston, and no interest in rekindling anything with Kimberly. He'd only attended the shower because Diane had made it sound urgent and important, and he'd realized too late that she'd manipulated him into being part of some weird fantasy. He apologized for causing problems, and said he'd blocked Diane's number and wouldn't have any further contact. I thanked him for calling and hung up feeling even more disturbed than before. My in-laws hadn't just invited an ex to our baby shower. They'd actively recruited him into their campaign to undermine my marriage. Kimberly and I spent the next few days processing everything that had happened. She called her parents and told them their behavior was unacceptable, and they weren't welcome at our home until they apologized. Robert had said they had nothing to apologize for and accused Kimberly of being influenced by my insecurities. Diane had cried and said she was just trying to help Kimberly see all her options before becoming a mother. The conversation had ended with Kimberly hanging up and blocking both their numbers. She'd cried for hours afterward, grieving the relationship with her parents she'd thought she had. I held her and promised we'd figure this out together. But privately, I was worried about what would happen when the baby was born. Would her parents show up at the hospital? Would they respect our boundaries or continue their campaign? I called my own parents and explained the entire situation. My father listened quietly and then said something that stuck with me. He said some people become so attached to a specific version of their child's future that they can't accept when reality diverges from their fantasy. He said Diane and Robert had probably invested so much emotional energy into imagining Kimberly's life with Austin that my existence represented a fundamental rejection of everything they'd built up in their minds. He suggested we might need legal counsel to establish clear boundaries and consequences. My mother agreed and gave me the name of a family lawyer she knew in Seattle named Diana Cross, who specialized in complex domestic situations. I scheduled a consultation with Diana Cross for the following week. She had 17 years of experience handling cases involving family conflict and boundaries. Her office was downtown in a high-rise with views of the Sound, and she greeted us with warm professionalism that immediately put Kimberly at ease. We spent 2 hours explaining the history of Robert and Diane's behavior, from the wedding planning through the shower incident. I showed her screenshots of their social media posts and text messages. Kimberly provided a timeline of their increasingly inappropriate comments about Austin. Diana listened carefully and took extensive notes. When we finished, she sat back and said this was one of the more extreme cases of parental boundary violation she'd encountered. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Diana explained that we had several options for protecting ourselves and our child. First, we could send a formal cease and desist letter demanding that Robert and Diane stop contacting us and stop discussing our family on social media. Second, we could establish a supervised contact arrangement where they could only see the baby with witnesses present. Third, if they continued escalating, we could pursue a restraining order based on harassment and emotional abuse. She said the key was documenting everything from this point forward, saving all messages and keeping detailed notes of any interactions. She drafted a cease and desist letter while we waited, and we reviewed it carefully before approving. The letter demanded that Robert and Diane stop all contact for 60 days while everyone cooled down, stop posting about our family online, and agree to family counseling before any future contact. The letter was sent via certified mail on a Friday afternoon. We knew Robert and Diane had received it when Kimberly's phone started ringing non-stop from blocked numbers. Melissa texted that their parents were furious and claiming we'd ambushed them with legal threats. Robert had apparently called the letter an aggressive overreaction and said we were being manipulated by lawyers trying to destroy families. Diane had posted a vague status on Facebook about children who turn on their parents and forget everything they've been given. The post had dozens of comments from their friends offering sympathy and calling younger generations entitled and ungrateful. None of them knew the full context, but the public performance of victimhood was effective at garnering support. We stuck to the 60-day contact ban, despite the pressure from Kimberly's extended family to reconcile. Her grandmother called asking us to forgive and forget, because family was precious. Her aunts sent long text messages about the importance of children having relationships with grandparents. Melissa was caught in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with both her parents and her sister. The stress was affecting Kimberly's pregnancy, and at her 36-week checkup, her doctor, Dr. Patricia Foster, noticed her blood pressure was elevated. Dr. Foster had been Kimberly's OB for the past 7 months and knew about the family situation. She expressed concern that the ongoing stress could trigger early labor or other complications. Dr. Foster recommended we see a therapist to help process the family trauma and develop coping strategies. She referred us to Dr. Michael Torres, a licensed clinical psychologist with 15 years specializing in family systems and pregnancy-related stress. We started weekly sessions with Dr. Torres, and the first meeting was intense. He asked detailed questions about Robert and Diane's behavior patterns and how long they'd been manifesting. Kimberly revealed things she'd minimized before, like how her mother had cried for a week when she and Austin broke up, or how her father had offered Austin money to move back to Sacramento and try again. Dr. Torres explained that Diane and Robert were exhibiting signs of enmeshment and projection, where they'd blurred the boundaries between their own needs and Kimberly's life. The therapy sessions gave us language for what we'd been experiencing. Dr. Torres explained that Diane had likely developed an emotional dependency on Austin as a pseudo-son, someone who validated her vision of herself as a successful mother. When that relationship ended, she'd experienced it as personal rejection rather than a natural evolution of Kimberly's life. Robert had supported his wife's attachment, possibly to maintain peace in his own marriage, or because he genuinely believed Austin was a better match based on superficial criteria like career and background. Together, they'd created a narrative where Kimberly's actual choices were wrong and needed to be corrected. The baby shower incident was an escalation of a pattern that had been building for years. We were 2 weeks away from the due date when Diane violated the cease and desist agreement. She'd apparently gotten our hospital information from Melissa and called the maternity ward claiming to be confirming her daughter's pre-registration. The charge nurse had asked her questions to verify identity, and Diane had successfully convinced them she was supposed to be on the approved visitor list. The hospital called me to confirm, and I discovered what she'd done. I immediately contacted Diana Cross, who sent an amended letter threatening legal action if there were any further violations. We also filed a formal complaint with the hospital and updated our birth plan to specify that Robert and Diane were explicitly not permitted in the building when Kimberly went into labor. Kimberly went into labor on a Thursday morning at 39 weeks. Her water broke while she was making breakfast, and we grabbed our hospital bags and drove through morning traffic to Swedish Medical Center. The labor was long and difficult, lasting 21 hours with complications that required monitoring. I stayed by her side the whole time, trying to help her breathe through contractions and manage pain. Around hour 15, a nurse came in and said there was a situation in the waiting room. Robert and Diane had shown up demanding to be let in, and security was dealing with them. I left Kimberly's side long enough to go to the waiting room and tell them to leave, or I'd call the police. Robert was red-faced and yelling at the security guard when I arrived. He said no one could keep him from seeing his daughter during labor. Diane was crying and saying she'd brought items Kimberly might need. I told them both that they weren't welcome, that they'd violated the cease and desist, and they needed to leave immediately. Robert stepped toward me like he might physically fight me, and the security guard moved between us. The guard's name was Daniel Kim, and he'd been working hospital security for 12 years. He calmly explained to Robert and Diane that they were trespassing and would be arrested if they didn't leave voluntarily. They eventually went, but Diane shouted as she was escorted out that I was keeping her from her grandchild, and she'd never forgive me. Our daughter was born at 3:17 a.m. on Friday morning, 6 pounds and 8 ounces of perfect healthy baby. Kimberly held her and cried with joy and exhaustion, and I cut the cord with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. We named her Sophie after Kimberly's grandmother, and she had dark hair and her mother's nose. The next 72 hours in the hospital were a cocoon of new parent bliss mixed with sleep deprivation. My parents came to visit and cried, holding their first grandchild. Melissa snuck in during approved hours and brought gifts. Kimberly's grandmother made the drive up from Sacramento and spent an hour rocking Sophie while telling stories about Kimberly as a baby. But Robert and Diane were not there, and that absence hung over everything. We brought Sophie home to our house in Queen Anne and started the overwhelming adjustment to life with a newborn. The first weeks were brutal with cluster feeding and sleep regression, but we managed by taking shifts and supporting each other. My parental leave allowed me to be home full-time, and Kimberly's maternity leave gave us months together as a new family. Friends brought meals and sent gifts, and slowly we found our rhythm. But the situation with Robert and Diane remained unresolved and was affecting Kimberly's mental health. She cried sometimes while feeding Sophie, mourning the relationship with her parents that should have existed around this milestone. Dr. Torres increased our therapy to twice a week and started Kimberly on medication for postpartum anxiety. 6 weeks after Sophie's birth, we received a package at our door. Inside was an expensive baby gift from Robert and Diane with a card that said they were sorry for everything and wanted to meet their granddaughter. Kimberly read the card and handed it to me without comment. I could see she wanted to believe they'd changed, that becoming grandparents had shifted something fundamental. But the card didn't actually apologize for specific behaviors or acknowledge wrongdoing. It was a generic sorry, followed by a demand for access. Diana Cross reviewed the card and advised that we shouldn't respond without requiring them to complete family counseling first. She drafted a letter outlining our conditions, documented therapy with a licensed professional, written accountability for past actions, and supervised visits only. Robert responded to the letter by hiring his own attorney. The lawyer sent us a letter threatening grandparents' rights litigation if we didn't provide immediate access to Sophie. California law gave grandparents the ability to sue for visitation rights under certain circumstances, and Robert's attorney was claiming that our denial of access was harming Sophie's well-being. Diana Cross said the case was weak because we were married and functioning parents, but it would still require us to appear in court and defend our choices. The legal threat felt like an escalation from emotional manipulation to institutional warfare, and it confirmed that Robert and Diane hadn't actually changed their approach. They'd just found a new weapon to use against us. The court date was scheduled for 3 months later, giving both sides time to gather evidence and build cases. Diana Cross advised us to document everything related to our parenting and Sophie's well-being. We kept detailed logs of her feeding schedule, sleep patterns, and developmental milestones. We got letters from Dr. Torres explaining the family situation and recommending limited contact for Kimberly's mental health. We compiled the entire history of Robert and Diane's behavior, with dates and screenshots. Diana said we needed to show the judge that our boundaries weren't arbitrary or vindictive, but protective measures based on documented harassment. During discovery, Robert and Diane's attorney requested all our therapy records, medical files, and personal communications. Diana fought to limit what they could access, but we still had to hand over significant amounts of private information. The process felt invasive and violating, like being punished for protecting ourselves. We also learned through discovery that Robert and Diane had been secretly filming our house from the street, documenting when we came and went. They'd hired a private investigator to photograph us at the park with Sophie, and they'd collected statements from neighbors about our parenting. The surveillance was legal, but deeply disturbing, and it revealed how far they were willing to go. The depositions happened 2 months before the court date. I sat in a conference room while Robert and Diane's attorney, a man named Gregory Thompson with 23 years in family law, asked me aggressive questions about my fitness as a father. He wanted to know about my work schedule and whether I'd ever left Sophie alone. He asked about my relationship with my own parents and implied I had abandonment issues that made me paranoid. He questioned my income and whether we could adequately provide for Sophie without help from her maternal grandparents. Every question felt designed to paint me as unstable or inadequate. Diana Cross objected frequently, but I still had to sit there and defend my basic competence for 6 hours. Kimberly's deposition was worse because Gregory Thompson focused on her mental health. He asked about her anxiety medication and therapy sessions, implying she was emotionally unstable. He brought up postpartum depression statistics and asked if she'd ever had thoughts of harming Sophie. He questioned whether she was making decisions independently or being controlled by me. Kimberly handled it with grace, but she came out of that room shaking and pale. That night, she told me she felt like being a good mother meant cutting contact with her parents because their presence in our lives caused more harm than their absence ever could. I agreed with her, but it broke my heart watching her grieve what should have been a loving relationship. The trial was scheduled for a Friday in late October, and we drove to the courthouse in Sacramento with Diana Cross and a folder full of documentation. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, with high ceilings and wood paneling that smelled like old paper. Robert and Diane sat on the other side with Gregory Thompson, and they wouldn't look at us directly. The judge was Honorable Ruth Blackwell, who'd been on the family court bench for 19 years. She reviewed both sets of documents while we waited, and I watched her eyebrows raise several times as she read through the evidence. Gregory Thompson argued that Robert and Diane were loving grandparents being denied access to their grandchild for petty reasons. He painted us as vindictive children punishing parents for minor disagreements. He showed photos of Robert and Diane's home with a nursery they'd set up for visits, emphasizing their commitment to being involved. He called character witnesses who testified that Robert and Diane were respected community members and devoted family people. He made our boundaries sound cruel and arbitrary, like we were harming Sophie by keeping her from willing grandparents. It was a compelling narrative if you ignored all the actual facts. Diana Cross dismantled their case systematically. She presented the timeline of harassment starting with the wedding planning and continuing through the baby shower. She showed the judge Robert's comment about Austin being the father Sophie deserved and explained the context. She submitted the social media posts where Diane publicly wished Kimberly had married her ex. She presented Dr. Torres' testimony about the psychological impact on Kimberly and the documented anxiety. She showed the cease and desist violations and the hospital incident. She methodically proved that Robert and Diane's behavior was a pattern of boundary violation that justified our protective measures. The evidence was overwhelming when laid out chronologically. Judge Blackwell asked to speak with us directly. She wanted to understand our position without attorneys filtering everything. Kimberly explained that she loved her parents but couldn't trust them to respect our family autonomy. She talked about growing up feeling responsible for her mother's emotions and how that pattern had continued into adulthood. She described the baby shower incident and how humiliated she'd felt in front of extended family. She said she wanted Sophie to have grandparents, but only if they could accept that she and I were Sophie's parents and primary decision-makers. The judge listened carefully and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. I could tell she was actually considering the nuance rather than just applying legal standards mechanically. The judge ruled from the bench that afternoon. She said Robert and Diane had demonstrated a pattern of boundary violation that justified supervised contact restrictions. She ordered that any visits with Sophie would happen only in the presence of a court-appointed supervisor for the next year. After that year, both parties would return to court to reassess whether unsupervised visits were appropriate. She also ordered Robert and Diane to complete family therapy with a court-approved counselor before any visits could begin. She denied their request for regular unsupervised grandparent rights and said the existing arrangement protected Sophie's best interests. The ruling felt like vindication, but also like a sad acknowledgement that we'd needed a judge to establish basic family boundaries. Robert and Diane left the courtroom without speaking to us. Gregory Thompson looked frustrated, and he made some comment to Diana about appealing the decision. Diana told him to go ahead and waste his client's money because the ruling was solid. We drove back to Seattle that evening feeling exhausted, but relieved. The legal battle had confirmed our instincts and given us institutional backing for our boundaries, but it had also cost us thousands in legal fees and months of stress during what should have been joyful time with our new baby. The supervised visits started 6 weeks later after Robert and Diane completed an initial evaluation with the court-ordered therapist. The supervisor was a retired social worker named Catherine Douglas with 31 years in child welfare. She met us at a neutral location with cameras and observation windows. Robert and Diane brought gifts and tried to act normal, but the awkwardness was palpable. They held Sophie carefully and made appropriate small talk, but I could see the resentment simmering under the surface. Catherine took notes on everything, and later told us she'd observed subtle attempts to undermine us, even in that controlled environment. Diane had made a comment about how different parenting styles were these days, and Robert had questioned our feeding choices. The pattern continued even under supervision. The therapy reports came back after 3 months showing minimal progress. Robert and Diane's therapist, Dr. Jennifer Nguyen, noted that they demonstrated little insight into how their behavior had been harmful. They attended sessions but spent most of the time justifying their actions and portraying themselves as victims. They showed no understanding of appropriate boundaries or how their campaign for Austin had impacted our marriage. Dr. Nguyen recommended continued supervised contact and suggested they might benefit from individual therapy before family sessions would be productive. The report confirmed what we already knew. Robert and Diane weren't interested in changing. They were just completing the court-ordered requirements to regain access to Sophie. We made the decision to move forward with supervised visits only, with no progression toward unsupervised time. Diana Cross helped us file documentation explaining our reasoning based on the therapy reports and Catherine's observations. Robert and Diane's attorney objected, but Judge Blackwell reviewed the evidence and agreed that unsupervised visits weren't in Sophie's best interest yet. The order was modified to require at least another year of supervised contact with quarterly reviews. Robert and Diane stopped showing up to visits after that ruling, apparently deciding that supervised access wasn't worth their time. Their last visit was in March, and they haven't attempted contact since. Sophie is 15 months old now, and she doesn't know her maternal grandparents. Sometimes that makes me sad for what could have been if Robert and Diane had been different people. But mostly I'm grateful that we protected her from their dysfunction and established our family on our own terms. Kimberly has processed her grief through therapy and has mostly accepted that her parents may never be part of our lives in a healthy way. Melissa visits regularly and is an amazing aunt. Kimberly's grandmother comes every few months and loves Sophie completely. We've built the family we needed from the people who showed up with respect and boundaries. My parents are incredible grandparents who follow our lead and support our choices. They never question our parenting or try to insert themselves inappropriately. They celebrate Sophie's milestones and babysit when asked and respect our boundaries naturally. Watching them with Sophie shows me what healthy grandparent relationships look like and confirms that Robert and Diane's behavior was never normal or acceptable. The contrast is stark and validating. Last week we got notice that Robert and Diane are moving to Arizona. Diane's sister lives there, and apparently they've decided to start fresh somewhere else. Part of me wonders if they'll eventually realize what they lost by choosing their fantasy about Austin over their actual daughter and grandchild. But mostly, I think they'll continue believing they were wronged and we were unreasonable. People like that rarely develop the self-awareness necessary for genuine change. They'll probably tell their new neighbors about the ungrateful daughter who kept them from their grandchild, leaving out the parts about the baby shower and the harassment and the court orders. Kimberly is pregnant again, due in December. This time, there's no anxiety about which grandparents to invite to the shower or what drama might unfold. We're having a small celebration with friends in Seattle, and the guest list includes only people who've earned their place in our lives. Sophie will be a big sister, and she'll grow up knowing that family means the people who show up with love and respect, not the people who share DNA but can't behave appropriately. That's the gift we're giving both our daughters. The gift of boundaries and the knowledge that they deserve to be protected from people who can't love them without conditions or control. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.